Don't settle for fakes. My dual-taining is the real deal.
Hello, this is mekklord and welcome to my top 10 of the best main boxes in the history of Duel Links. This video will focus on main boxes that drastically impacted the metagame on which they were released and how good of investments they were, at least at the time. But first, some honorable mentions, starting with Aerial Assault. Aerial Assault included support for two archetypes that had been previously released, Black Wings and Insectors. And though it did help the former get a foothold in the metagame, it didn't do much for the latter, unfortunately. It also included a bevy of interesting generic cards such as Bryonak, Darkened Dragon, Swallow's Nest, and Invoked Purgatrio, which would show up in those pesky invoked decks that were already pretty good at the time. The only reason why this is an honorable mention is because this box did require you to have prior Black Wings cards if you wanted to make the most out of it. For the second honorable mention, we have Galactic Origin. Now this set, released in the middle of the GX era, included Gladiator Beast, which were a pretty good archetype on release, but not much else. Saphira, Queen of the Dragons, was an important card for Cyber Angels at the time, but it also included one of the most powerful cards in all of Duel Links, Cosmic Cyclone. And last but not least for the honorable mentions, Future Horizon. This set included a lot of Cyber Dragon support that helped propel the deck to top tier status, making it one of the fiercest OTK decks of the D-Sword format. It also included Dark Magical Circle, a card that would be very important for Dark Magician decks going forward and establish them as one of the most annoying decks you could be facing. Last but not least, it included an interesting archetype in Super Heavy Samurai and some decent support for older decks such as Thunder Dragon Duo. Once again, this box is not included in the main list because you did need to dig through a lot of Cyber Dragon themed boxes in order to make the most out of this one. Now let's get started onto the list with number 10, Blazing Rose. The cover card of Blazing Rose Black Rose Dragon is obviously a really good card even to this day, but this box also introduced another strong generic synchro option, Vermilion Dragon Mech. This box also introduced two very interesting and playable archetypes in Metaphys and Subterrors, and though they were never the most powerful decks of their era, they were playable and decently annoying for the time. At number 9 we have Abyss Encounters. This set, released in the late GX era, introduced two very powerful archetypes to the game, Sea Stealth Attack and Aliens, both of which were immediately the best decks of their format after release. It also introduced a third archetype that was pretty playable as well, Archfiends. Last but not least, it included some decent generic cards that would see play in later decks, such as Gishki Chain and Ties of the Brethren. At number 8 we have Witch's Sorcery. This set is infamous for introducing Witchcrafters to the game, an archetype so powerful, so broken on release that it led to a card being emergency limited 1 as soon as they dropped, and a ban list to take care of them a couple of months later. This set also had Evil Eye, an interesting and still playable archetype to this day, and Predaplants, which are bound to get more support as Yuri releases into the game. Speaking of decks that are bound to get more support, Speedroid and Altergeist were also introduced in this box, and last but not least it also had some decent generic cards such as Aemar the Conquering Blow and Masked Chameleon. At number 7 we have Warriors Unite. This set, released in the middle of the 5Ds era, introduced 6 samurai support that would shoot up the deck into tier 1, possibly tier 0 status. This set also introduced desk bots, and though they would get reprints later, it was a decent budget deck that you could be playing and succeed with for a very long time. Last but not least, it had some decent generic cards as well, including Concentrating Current, which would become very powerful in the hands of invoked players, Herald of the Abyss, which would become a prime form of removal against invoked in D-Sword format, and Necrofusion, which saw fringe playability in Melodious and Boral amongst other decks. Last but not least, it also introduced Quick Draw Synchrons and a couple of Synchron/Warrior cards, but these never unfortunately took the deck to playable status. At number 6 we have Crimson Kingdom, a set released in the late Duel Monsters era. This set introduced a whole new take on the Red Eyes deck that was terrorizing the meta, introducing Red Eyes Zombie Turbo using the newly released Gosuki, Red Eyes Zombie Dragon, and Red Eyes Wyvern in order to form a recursive beatdown strategy that would become the best of this format for a long time. This set also introduced Ultimate Providence, which would essentially become the first Omni-Negate available and very playable in a wide variety of formats. Last but not least, it introduced two very powerful fusion monsters in the form of Buster Blader and Dark Paladin, and though the latter was playable at the time but never after this, the former would show up in a lot of metagame after receiving some new support throughout the ages. At number 5 we have one of the most recent releases, Braver Victory. This set introduced Mech Knight supports, immediately shooting the deck up to tier 1 status or maybe tier 1 contender status, being one of the most frustrating decks you could be facing on ladder, able to skill drain you and then end you with a Galaxy OTK. This set also introduced a very playable budget-ish deck in the form of Infernoids, an aggro strategy that's only really needed a couple of cards to function and no staples outside of extra deck ones. Last but not least, this set also introduced some support for Metal Foes, Trains, and other decks that were decently playable, though that was not enough for these decks to come back into the metagame. And yes, I completely forgot to talk about Draco Slayers that were also introduced in this deck, one of the archetypes with the most potential in Duel Links at the moment, but unfortunately too little too late to have a real impact. Coming up at number 4 we have Valiant Souls, a set released in the late GX era once again. This set introduced Masked Heroes, a very powerful archetype that was able to OTK right out the gate pretty easily. It also included the Paleozoics, which was a pretty decent archetype on its own, but Paleozoicadia was a strong generic staple for years to come. Another very interesting archetype that was introduced with this main box were Gurgias, which were also a pretty powerful deck and a rather budget option, all things considered. Last but not least, it also included some decent generic staples such as Witch Raider, which would take care of pesky back row for you, and Needle Sealing, which has seen a lot of play as of late. Starting the top 3 with another DSOD hero box, once again Judgment Force. The cover card of this box, Blue Eye Spirit Dragon, was one of the cards needed for Blue Eyes to make a push in the metagame and eventually become the base deck of a format weakened by a very powerful ban list in the early Zexal era. This deck also introduced some Lightsworn supports that were used both in pure Lightsworn's deck and generic graveyard-centric strategies as well. It also introduced Lunar Lights, one of the most powerful decks of this era, capable of OTKing opponents or just sitting on Saber Dancer and forcing your opponent to deal with an untargetable monster. It also gave Dragunity a vital piece of support in Dragunity Curse, introduced Orcust, which you are sure to hear about in following sets, and some Necros, though they were not really playable outside of gimmicky, janky Quintet Magician OTK strategies. It also gave us Glow Up Ball for what it's worth, and Gradles, which for a time was the best way to play the Water Xyz territory of the Shark skill. At second place, number 2, we have Dark Dimension. The DSOD era started with a bang on this one, introducing Invoked into the game, which was a very powerful control deck relying on Invoked Cositus, which is now banned, and able to OTK with Invoked Magellanica, but also introduced the Element Sabers, an archetype that worked perfectly with Invoked and was able to control the board on its own with a Book of Moon on legs. Other archetypes included in this main box were Gravekeepers, with the official release of Necro Valley, which used to be locked behind a selection box, Thunder Dragons, which were decently playable on release but would only grow stronger as months passed, and Magician Girls, including a very powerful spellcaster support in the form of Magicalized Fusion and Quintet Magician for easy OTKs. This set also introduced gadgets and a decent boss monster for Karakuris, which would become much more relevant in a couple of months. And now for my number 1, Link Revolution. Link Revolution introduced support for Salamangreat in the form of Salamangreat Circle, but also generic cyber support that was very good for the deck and made it the best deck of the format. Even after receiving a couple of nerfs, the deck is very strong and playable, thanks in large part to its insane consistency. This set also introduced a budget option, well, I should say another budget option, in the form of World Legacy, a playable Link-centric combo deck that is sure to take a couple of games every now and then. This set also gave us Dark Magician support, including Apprentice Illusion Magician that also used to be locked behind a selection box, and Eternal Soul, which was pretty decent for the deck but did nothing to salvage it. And I didn't even get to talk about Code Talkers. Decode Talker, and the deck centered around it, is still very playable to this day, a pretty flexible engine that can be combined with other decks including Mech Knights or Salamangreat, and overall a very powerful strategy once again. In terms of generic staples, Warning Point and Pot of Duality are both to be commended, as well as the first official kaiju in the game, Dogoran. All in all, between the slew of generic good cards and some very powerful archetype concentrated in this box, I can't help but think of Link Revolution as the best main box of all time. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Do you agree or disagree? Is there something that I've missed maybe? Make sure to let me know in the comments, and stay tuned for the top 10 best mini boxes in the history of Duel Links. Thanks everyone for watching once again, make sure to like and subscribe, and see you next time.